sound settings. So we're going to go into Options, Audio Settings, and here we go. Here we can set our driver. We have the primary sound driver, which is for the computer, and that's just going to do whatever your control panel is set to. We have the speakers, which is the USB interface I'm using, and then we have the actual driver for the computer's audio device, which isn't really that great. And then we have several ASIO devices. We have a DigiDesign driver, which I use with my MBox, and then we have an ASIO for All version 2, which takes any of the devices we have and can use them in an ASIO type setting. It's a terrific tool and allows you to have better quality than any of these drivers up here. So that's important. We're going to talk about ASIO in the next tutorial, so keep that just on the edge of your brain before we get there. Now we have this thing here, clock source, Big Ben. We don't have any choices for the moment when using the ASIO for All because this is what is using that. Now what is a clock source and why is it important? Well, anytime you're using digital audio, you need to have a master clock, typically set to internal. So it's either the audio interface you're using or sometimes the software can take control. But it has to be the master, and then anytime you have additional pieces of hardware, something like a digital tape deck or even a CD player, etc., those need to all be clocked off of one source so that there's no problems in what's called jitter as the digital signals conflict with each other and they don't line up correctly. Think of this as a gear where all those prongs have to go and line up exactly right for it to turn. So that becomes a problem if that's not set. And if you just have Big Ben, it means you don't really have anything to hook up. But if you are hooking external software or hardware to this, you'll need to have one be the master and one be the slave, and some way to convert that clock over, either a digital cable or some other mechanism. Priority. This is going to tell us how much priority to put on our software here. I always put the highest so that things in the background don't take away from it. Tells us how many underruns there are. That means sometimes when we push it too hard, and what happens is at that point that you lose audio quality. You get clicks and pops or it just stops. So that keeps track of it. It's usually not really detrimental to your session. It won't crash your computer, but sometimes it'll cause problems. And in that case, that's when you do the buffer size, which is the next thing we're going to look at in the final of these 3 tutorials on audio. We also have safe overload, so it's no risk of the graphical interface freezing when overloads occur. So this is actually going to cut it off a little early so that you don't have any of those type of problems. So let's move over here to the mixer. This sets our sample rate, and it needs to line up with what your audio interface is capable of. For instance, if you have an interface that doesn't do 192, then it's not going to do any benefit to have that set here. I would line it up to whatever you have, and for most cases do 44/100 because that's the sample rate of a CD, and that's typically the highest end format that you're going to be putting your music on. If you're working with picture, then maybe 48 is going to be the option because that really does what DVDs use, and that is what is done for picture and movie theaters, etc. So if you're really shooting for that, then do 48. The less you have to convert this later, the better your audio will sound. So pick your end format. We talk about interpolation a little bit later, just briefly, but this is where you can set the interpolation point sync, and if you're using, for instance, 64 or higher, that's going to give you a better idea of what their final render is going to sound like because it can do that non-real time. However, you can now use 64 point sync real time in FL Studio 8 as they've made it a lot more efficient protocol. Okay, reset plugins on transport. This means when you're moving the transport around, it's actually going to allow you to relocate faster. And then we can use the mixer as a playback position. That's only if you get jerky playback cursors, and that might help a little bit. And then we can set which mixer track we want to do previews. So if you're previewing something like a metronome target or something like that, then that will choose which mixer comes out on. Okay, so that's the basics of the audio settings. Next we're going to talk about the Yasu driver.